The midnight sky exploded with ribbons of fire, as Rebecca Norwood watched her family's ranch house burn to the ground, her heart crumbling like the charred timber that had once formed the only home she'd ever known. Colorado Territory, 1875, was unforgiving to those who stood alone, and at 22 years old, Rebecca found herself suddenly, devastatingly alone. "There's nothing more to be done," Sheriff Mills said, his hand resting awkwardly on her shoulder. "The fire's taken it all." Rebecca stared silently, the heat still searing her face despite standing a safe distance away. Her parents had been in town visiting friends when lightning struck the barn. The flames had spread so quickly to the main house that Rebecca had barely escaped with her life, managing only to save her father's pocket watch and her mother's wedding band. "You can stay at the boarding house until your folks return," the sheriff offered, but they both knew her parents wouldn't be back for another 2 weeks. 2 weeks with no home, no clothes beyond what she wore, and precious little money. "I appreciate it," she said, her voice hollow as the last of the roof collapsed in a shower of embers. The small crowd that had gathered to witness the destruction began to disperse, helpless against nature's fury. Only one figure remained, a tall man Rebecca recognized as Flynn Keller, the reclusive rancher whose property bordered the eastern edge of her family's land. Flynn approached slowly, hat in hand. At 28, he was known throughout the county for 2 things: his skill with horses and his avoidance of social gatherings. His eyes, reflecting the dying flames, met hers. "Miss Norwood," he said, his voice low and steady, "I have a proposition if you'll hear it." Rebecca straightened her shoulders, acutely aware of her soot-streaked dress and wild hair. "Mr. Keller, I'm afraid I'm in no position to entertain propositions." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "Not that kind, Miss Norwood. I've a cabin on my property. It's small but sound. You're welcome to it until your parents return or you can rebuild." Suspicion flared. "And what would you expect in return?" "Nothing improper," he assured her. "Perhaps some help with cooking. I've been living on beans and coffee for longer than my stomach appreciates." Rebecca glanced back at the smoldering ruins of her home. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford tonight. "I accept your offer, Mr. Keller, but only until my parents return." Flynn nodded. "I'll bring the wagon around at first light. The boarding house will be more comfortable tonight." "No," Rebecca said firmly. "I want to stay to make sure nothing more happens." Flynn studied her for a moment, then shrugged off his coat and handed it to her. "The night air gets cold even in summer. I'll keep watch with you." They sat in silence as the flames died down, the night growing darker as the fire surrendered its last breath. Flynn occasionally added wood to a small campfire he'd built a safe distance from the ruins. "My father built that house when he married my mother," Rebecca said finally, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the campfire. 17 years of their life gone in an hour." Flynn nodded. "Fire's a cruel master, takes what it wants and leaves only ashes behind." "What will I tell them when they return?" she wondered aloud. "You'll tell them that you survived," Flynn said simply. "That's what matters most." As midnight approached, Rebecca felt exhaustion washing over her. Flynn must have noticed, for he spoke again. "Ashes cool and hearts rebuild here," he said, gesturing to the land around them. "My father used to say that after we lost our first homestead in a fire. It meant that even when everything burns down, the foundation remains. You can build something new, sometimes something better." Rebecca studied him in the flickering light. "I didn't know your family suffered a similar fate." "I was 10, Flynn said, poking at the campfire with a stick. "We started over just like you will." When dawn broke, Rebecca rose stiffly from where she'd been dozing against a fallen log. Flynn was already loading her few salvaged belongings onto his wagon. "Found these," he said, holding out a scorched wooden box. Inside lay a few pieces of her mother's jewelry that had somehow survived the inferno. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the box to her chest. The ride to Flynn's ranch was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. His land was well kept, with neat fencing and healthy cattle grazing in the distance. The cabin he'd mentioned sat at the edge of a small creek, shaded by cottonwood trees. "It's not much," Flynn said as he helped her down from the wagon, "but it's watertight and warm." The cabin was indeed small but surprisingly well appointed. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while a neatly made bed and simple table with 2 chairs filled the rest of the space. "Where will you stay?" Rebecca asked, suddenly realizing she might have displaced him. "Main house is just over that rise," Flynn pointed. "This was the original homestead. My father kept it standing after we built the bigger house, said it reminded him of where we started." Over the next days, Rebecca settled into a routine. She cooked meals for Flynn as agreed, finding comfort in the simple domesticity of the task. He brought her fabric from town, and she began sewing new dresses to replace those lost in the fire. One evening, as they sat on the cabin's small porch watching the sunset, Flynn cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about your family's place," he said. "If you're willing, I could help rebuild before your parents return. I've got men who could assist, and lumber from the sawmill." Rebecca stared at him. "Why would you do that?" Flynn looked uncomfortable. "Neighbors help neighbors out here. It's how we survive. We've been neighbors for 5 years, Mr. Keller, and I don't believe we exchanged more than 10 words before my house burned down." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "I'm not much for socializing, Miss Norwood, never have been, but that doesn't mean I don't notice things." "What things?" she asked. "How you always bring meals to the widow Jenkins. How you taught reading to the Peterson children last winter when their mother was ill." He shrugged. "Kindness shouldn't go unrewarded." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. "I didn't realize anyone noticed." "I notice more than people think," Flynn said quietly. The next day, Flynn rode out early, returning with 4 ranch hands and a wagon loaded with lumber. To Rebecca's surprise, they began clearing the burned remains of her family home. "Mr. Keller," she protested when he stopped for water, "this is too much. I can't possibly repay you." "Did I ask for payment?" he countered, wiping sweat from his brow. "For a week, the men worked from sunrise to sunset." Rebecca cooked for them all, grateful beyond words. Each evening, Flynn would walk her back to the cabin, their conversations growing longer with each passing day. She learned he'd been orphaned at 16 when his parents died of influenza, leaving him the ranch and the burden of running it alone. He'd never had time for courting or social calls, his life consumed by the endless work of keeping the ranch profitable. "Don't you get lonely?" she asked one evening as they walked beneath a sky brilliant with stars. Flynn was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Yes," he finally admitted, but loneliness seemed safer than disappointment. "What disappointment?" he shrugged. "People leave, Miss Norwood. They die or they find something better elsewhere. The land is the only thing that stays." "That's a bleak outlook," she said softly. "Perhaps," he agreed, "but it served me well enough." Rebecca touched his arm lightly. "I think you deserve more than well enough, Mr. Keller." His eyes met hers, something unreadable in their depths. "Flynn," he said, "if we're to be friends, you might as well use my given name." "Rebecca," she offered in return, feeling a strange flutter in her chest when he repeated it. As the days passed, Rebecca found herself watching for Flynn's arrival each morning, disappointing though his news often was. "The lumber's green," he told her 2 weeks into the rebuilding. "It'll warp if we use it now. We need to wait another week at least." Rebecca's heart sank. My parents will return before then. I've sent word to them in Denver, Flynn said. Explain the situation. You did what? Rebecca's voice rose. Without consulting me, Flynn looked taken aback. I thought you'd be relieved they wouldn't arrive to a surprise. It wasn't your place to make that decision, she snapped, then immediately regretted her harshness when she saw the hurt in his eyes. You're right, he said stiffly. I overstepped. My apologies, Miss Norwood. He turned to leave, but Rebecca caught his arm. No, I'm sorry. You've been nothing but kind, and I'm being ungrateful. Of course they should know. I'm just afraid. Of what? He asked, his expression softening. Of their disappointment. I should have been more careful with the lamps, checked the barn more thoroughly during the storm. Flynn's hand covered hers where it still rested on his arm. The fire wasn't your fault, Rebecca. Sometimes bad things just happen. His touch sent warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Confused by her reaction, she pulled away. I should see to lunch for the men. Flynn watched her hurry toward the outdoor kitchen they'd set up, a thoughtful expression on his face. That evening, Flynn didn't walk her back to the cabin. Instead, one of his ranch hands escorted her, explaining that Flynn had ridden to town on urgent business. Rebecca told herself the disappointment she felt was merely because she'd grown accustomed to their evening talks. Flynn didn't return the next day, or the next. The men continued working but refused to say where their boss had gone. On the third day, Rebecca's patience ran out. Where is Mr. Keller? She demanded of Thomas, Flynn's foreman. Thomas scratched his beard. Can't rightly say, miss. He asked us not to worry you. Well, I am worried, she admitted. It's not like him to disappear without a word. Thomas's weathered face softened. He thinks highly of you, miss. Whatever his business, I'm sure he has good reason for it. That evening, Rebecca sat alone on the cabin porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her heart leap, but it wasn't Flynn who appeared around the bend in the road. It was her parents. Rebecca. Her mother cried, practically falling from the wagon in her haste. Oh, my darling girl. The reunion was tearful, full of her mother's relieved sobs and her father's gruff assurances that things would be set right. They listened gravely as she recounted the night of the fire and Flynn's subsequent generosity. This Keller fellow, her father said, frowning slightly. His intentions are honorable. He's been a perfect gentleman, Rebecca assured him. He's just kind. Her father looked skeptical but nodded. We'll thank him properly when he returns. In the meantime, we've brought supplies. We can stay at the boarding house while the rebuilding is completed. No need for that, came a familiar voice. Flynn rode up, looking tired but pleased. I've arranged accommodations for you at my main house. There's plenty of room and you'll be closer to oversee the construction. Rebecca's father eyed him warily. That's generous, Mr. Keller, but please, Flynn interrupted. I insist. Rebecca can show you the way. Before anyone could protest further, Flynn tipped his hat and rode toward the construction site, leaving Rebecca to explain to her confused parents. That night, after settling her parents in Flynn's surprisingly spacious home, Rebecca sought him out. She found him on the back porch, smoking a cigarette and staring at the stars. You've been avoiding me, she said without preamble. Flynn didn't deny it. Thought it best to give you space, your parents returning and all. Where did you go? He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. Denver, to speak with your father's bank. Rebecca unfolded the document, scanning it in the dim light spilling from the house windows. This is a loan, Flynn nodded, for rebuilding. I know your father had concerns about having enough funds after last year's poor harvest. You arranged a loan for my father. Rebecca was stunned. How? Used some of my land as collateral, Flynn said, as if it were nothing. The bank was amenable. Rebecca stared at him. Why would you risk your property for us? Flynn's eyes met hers, steady and sure. Because some things are worth the risk. The weight of his words settled between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Rebecca took a step closer. Flynn. The back door opened and her father stepped out. Ah, there you are. Your mother's asking for you, Rebecca. With a last look at Flynn, she went inside, her thoughts whirling. The next few days were a flurry of activity. With her parents taking charge of the rebuilding, Rebecca found herself with less reason to interact with Flynn. He kept his distance, polite but reserved when their paths crossed. She told herself it was for the best, that whatever had been growing between them was merely gratitude on her part and kindness on his. Then came the day when everything changed. Rebecca had ridden to town for supplies, enjoying the rare solitude. On her return, she saw smoke rising from the direction of the construction site. Panic seized her as memories of that terrible night flooded back. She urged her horse to a gallop, praying she was mistaken. She wasn't. A fire had broken out, started by a discarded cigarette that had ignited the sawdust. Her father and the workers were desperately trying to control the blaze before it spread to the new framework. "Where's Mother?" Rebecca shouted as she dismounted. Her father pointed toward Flynn's cabin. She went to rest, Flynn's helping her back to the main house. Relief washed over Rebecca, only to be replaced by fresh fear as one of the workers shouted a warning. A support beam, weakened by the fire, was giving way. Her father stood directly in its path. Everything seemed to slow down. Rebecca screamed, her father looked up, and then a blur of motion as Flynn appeared from nowhere, tackling her father out of the way as the beam crashed down. When the dust settled, Flynn lay motionless, pinned beneath the smoldering timber. The next hours passed in a haze of terror. The fire was extinguished, Flynn was freed and carried to his house, and the doctor summoned from town. Rebecca sat outside his bedroom, deaf to her mother's pleas that she rest. "He has to be all right," she whispered, over and over. "He has to be." When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was grave. "He's alive, but his injuries are serious. Broken ribs, a fractured leg, and he inhaled a lot of smoke. The next 24 hours will tell." "May I see him?" Rebecca asked. The doctor hesitated. "He's unconscious." But a familiar voice sometimes helps. Flynn lay pale and still against the white sheets. Rebecca took his hand, alarmed at how cold it felt. "You listen to me, Flynn Keller," she said fiercely. "You don't get to be a hero and then leave. That's not how this works." She stayed through the night, talking until her voice grew hoarse. She told him about her childhood, her dreams, her fears. And somewhere in those dark hours, she admitted the truth she'd been hiding from herself. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she whispered, pressing his hand to her cheek. "So you have to wake up and give me the chance to find out for sure." Dawn was breaking when Flynn's fingers twitched in hers. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on her face with obvious effort. "Rebecca." His voice was a rasp. "I'm here," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You saved my father." Flynn attempted a smile. "Couldn't let anything happen to your family, not after everything else. Why would you risk your life like that?" she demanded, even as she gently brushed hair from his forehead. Flynn's eyes held hers. "Same reason I risked my land. Some things are worth it." Rebecca's heart pounded. "What things?" "You," he said simply. "Everything I've done has been for you." The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Rebecca leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gentle kiss that said everything words couldn't. Flynn's recovery was slow but steady. Rebecca rarely left his side, reading to him, helping change his bandages and gradually learning all the things that made him the man he was. Her parents, seeing their daughter's happiness, extended their stay, taking over the rebuilding efforts. One evening, as Rebecca sat beside Flynn's bed working on her embroidery, he cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "about what happens when your house is finished." Rebecca's hand stilled. "What about it?" "You'll move back with your parents." "Yes," she agreed cautiously. Flynn struggled to sit up straighter. Unless, her heart began to race. "Unless you'd consider staying here as my wife." Rebecca stared at him. "Are you proposing to me while you're bedridden with broken ribs?" A hint of his old smile appeared. "Not the most romantic setting, I admit, but I can't risk waiting until I'm healed. You might come to your senses by then." Rebecca set aside her embroidery and moved to sit on the edge of his bed. "Flynn Keller, you are the most frustrating, wonderful man I've ever known. You took me in when fire took my home at midnight. You told me that ashes cool and hearts rebuild here. And now I know that my heart has rebuilt itself around you." Flynn's eyes widened. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," she confirmed, leaning forward to kiss him again. They were married that autumn, once Flynn could stand without assistance and Rebecca's family home was completed. The ceremony took place on the land between their two properties, symbolizing the union not just of two people but of two legacies. Winter found them cozy in Flynn's home, now brightened by Rebecca's touch. They often sat before the fire in the evenings, planning their future together. "I never thought I'd find this," Flynn admitted one night, his arm around his wife as they watched the flames dance in the hearth. "Someone who makes the ranch feel like more than just land and livestock, someone who makes it home." Rebecca rested her head on his shoulder. "And I never imagined losing my home would lead me to finding a new one with you." Spring brought new beginnings. The wildflowers bloomed across the joined properties, and Rebecca discovered she was expecting their first child. "A son to carry on the ranch," her father declared proudly when they shared the news. "Or a daughter to keep us all in line," Flynn countered with a wink at his wife. As Rebecca's body changed with the growing life inside her, Flynn built a cradle from wood salvaged from her family's original home, a testament to the beauty that could rise from destruction. Their daughter was born as summer ripened the land around them. They named her Faith, for the belief that had brought them together and carried them through the darkest times. On the anniversary of the fire that had destroyed Rebecca's home, they stood together on the porch of their house, watching the sunset with their infant daughter sleeping in Flynn's arms. "1 year ago today," Rebecca mused, "I thought my world had ended." Flynn kissed her temple gently. "And now?" Rebecca smiled up at him, at the man who had taught her that sometimes the worst moments led to the best ones, that destruction could pave the way for creation, and that love could indeed rise from the ashes. "Now I know it was just beginning." As darkness fell, they went inside together, closing the door on the past and embracing the future they had built from the ruins of what once was. In the distance, a new house stood where an old one had burned, a testament to resilience. And between the two properties, no fence divided the land, only wildflowers grew, connecting what had once been separate into one harmonious whole. 5 years later, Rebecca stood on that same porch, watching Flynn teach their daughter to ride her first pony while their 3-year-old son clapped his hands in excitement. The land flourished under their combined care, the ranch prospering beyond what either family had achieved alone. "Mama," Faith called. "Look at me." Rebecca waved, her heart full. The fire that had seemed like an ending had been just the beginning of a love story written in ashes and rebuilt with hope. And as Flynn looked up at her, his smile as warm as the day he'd first offered her shelter. She knew that some flames were meant not to destroy, but to forge something unbreakable. "I love you," he mouthed across the distance. "And I love you," she whispered back, knowing that some things didn't need to be spoken aloud to be perfectly understood.